Starvation is always intentional. It's always by design. The way you know there's a famine, when the first child dies from hunger. Israel said they're going to starve the Palestinians because they want to eliminate them and they treat them as subhumans. And then they did the thing that they were going to say. And then the effects happen as predicted. How do you know it's a genocide and starvation? Because they fucking told us and did it.
Welcome to a special episode of This Is Not a Watermelon. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have the authors, or two of the authors of this report, Palestine and the Right to Food, UN Special Rapporteur, Michael Fakhri, and illustrator and comic journalist. I'm not sure. I think that makes sense. Omar Khouri in the studio. This is our first episode recording in the studio since the ceasefire in Lebanon has been signed. Today is January 6th. Hopefully we're going to get this out on January 8th, but welcome everybody. Welcome you guys.
Thank you, Mikey.
Thanks for having us.
So this report, Palestine and the Right to Food, is a report about essentially it's about starvation. And I think a good place to start, maybe Michael, will start with you. You cover this in the report, but what is starvation?
Oh, it's an ongoing fight over who gets to answer that question.
Yeah.
Shortest way to answer it is it's a way of using food to kill people. Some people think starvation is the result of natural disasters, drought, locusts, whatever. But really, in modern history, what I mean by that, in the last 60 years, last 100 years, starvation is always intentional. It's always by design. It's one group is denying another group access to what they need to live. So it's not just denial of food, water, housing, healthcare, medicine. So it's a way of killing people, usually in a slow, vicious, cruel way, always intentional, always systemic. And so it's hunger, but it's when hunger becomes an issue of immediate death, right? So that's just in very general terms is how I would describe it.
It's interesting because even the term starvation has this like passive element to it. It doesn't sound like an active verb, to starve.
Right. And the other word that makes it even more passive is a famine. There is a famine. I can't famine you.
Yeah.
Or faminize, right? And if you notice, a lot of people, often in the news, they'll use the word famine. And you start to pay attention, and you don't see the word starvation, which is still a verb. In law, starvation is a war crime. Famine does not have a legal definition. So the recent arrest warrants that were issued against Netanyahu and Gallant from Israel, one of the core allegations is starvation. And it's the first time that the International Criminal Court has issued warrants on starvation as a war crime. So part of the report is to explain, what does starvation mean? What does it look like? How is it experienced? You know, we're focusing on the illustrated part of the report, but it's part of a UN report that I wrote that is also text. And in it, I give a new legal definition to starvation. How do we know when there's a famine? Right now, in official terms, there's a group of experts. They're independent but affiliated with the UN. And what they do is they measure the number of dead people as a shorthand. And based on those numbers, they say, because so many people died from hunger, that means there is famine. And I thought, why are we counting graves as a way to determine whether there's famine or not? People know when they're experiencing it. So the argument I make, and it's being picked up, it's catching on, I'm seeing it covered in news reports more and more, is the way you know there's a famine, when the first child dies from hunger. Because when we're hungry, and I've seen this in my work, what's the first thing you do? You feed your kids. You feed your neighbor's kids. You feed whatever kids are around. When you're hungry and you can't feed your child, it means you're holding your child and they're wasting away in your arms, and then they die. That's all you need to know. that means that your social system is under attack and you're unable to feed your child. We don't need statistics and experts. That's all you need to know. So that's what this report is doing, is highlighting the meaning, the experience, what's going on.
Yeah. Another kind of basic question is, I think if I remember correctly, the text report starts with a really basic sentence like, Israel is starving Palestine, something like that.
Something like, I don't remember, yeah.
Is that a controversial statement?
I'm very, so first, thank you for reading the report closely. I spend a lot of time on the first sentence and the last sentence. Yeah. Subject, action, verb, or subject, verb, object, right?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be controversial. It is in the UN. I was the first UN affiliated person to declare a famine in Gaza. That was considered controversial. I was one of the very few people that called it a genocide within the UN system within weeks. And part of me was surprised, like, why is it a big deal? I get the question by journalists, how do you know it's a famine? How do you know it's a genocide? And I laugh, and it's not a laugh because it's funny. It's a laugh of absurdity, which is, well, because Israel said they're going to starve the Palestinians because they want to eliminate them and they treat them as subhumans. And then they did the thing that they were going to say. And then the effects happen as predicted. How do you know it's a genocide and starvation? Because they fucking told us and did it.
Yeah.
That's the argument. You don't need to be a sophisticated expert from the UN to figure it out. So the more interesting question is, why can't the United Nations and why can't officials from different countries state the obvious is the more important question.
Yeah, I'll get to this part of the report, and maybe we'll give a context about how this collaboration started. But there's one part here that's basically talking about not the crisis around food, but the crisis around the international system. And this idea that this act of genocide essentially is pulling away at the strings of this entire system, and it's kind of collapsing in front of ourselves.
That it's just a hyper sped up example of what this system that runs the whole world will do to all of us eventually. It's showing us basically what's going to happen down the line to everybody, and that it's not a problem just between Israelis and Palestinians. It's the problem of this, when we're talking about food, it's the entire food system all around the world that is corrupt and that is harmful and is not looking to give you healthy food. It's just looking to sell you stuff and extract it. So we just kind of wanted to pull out for a minute and be like, we're not just talking about Israel and Palestine here. And watch out, everybody. This is coming for all of us. Us in Lebanon, we're really the next in line. It just happened right after. And then, but the same system is coming for all. It's already happening in so many other places in the world, and this is one of the problems that are highlighted now in the news cycle. But what's going on in Sudan? What's going on? Like, these are all the same problem. What's going on in the Congo? What's going on in Haiti? These are all the same problem, which people tend to be like, no, let's talk about Israel and Palestine. This is its own problem, but it's not.
Yeah, like Flint, Michigan, and they kind of rhyme, right? It's part of the same. It's part of the same idea. Let's back up. How did this collaboration start? Like, if somebody said there's going to be a report, a very somber report about starvation of Palestinians in Gaza that didn't start on October 7th, but has been exacerbated since then. The logical conclusion isn't we should illustrate this, right? So maybe Omar to talk a little bit about how this started.
1994 Tripoli, playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, yeah, as all our stories begin, there's Dungeons and Dragons, and actually it comes out in the report. Obviously, there's a dragon at some point, but this is something that it's Michael who started it. One day, Michael, I've been working in comics forever. I'm one of the founders of Samanda. I've been working in comics for ages, and I've been recently doing nonfiction comics, working with the Nib, and I did a part of a book called Guantanamo Voices, and I did something about Sudanese refugees and migrant workers in Lebanon called Cardboard Camp. So I've been working on nonfiction comics and like human rights stuff, and Michael basically came to me. He's like, "Look, I want my reports to reach humans." He's like, "Human right." This is a quote from Michael. Like, he wants human rights reports for humans to read instead of just like, put them on a shelf somewhere, on a virtual shelf somewhere in the UN, and only specialists, like hyper specialized people read them, or academics that are writing a paper specifically on this thing. And he's like, "I want people to, connect with this work. I'm working, and this is something that people should know." And he sent me his first few like reports and texts, and I read them, and I'm like, oh yeah, I like automatically learned so much. And his writing is not very dry anyway.
Yeah.
And he kind of writes the way he speaks, like he writes like a speech. And I found myself kind of like pacing around the room and giving a speech when I was reading his report. I'm like, oh, okay, this is kind of all important stuff that, mainly the fact that a lot of people still think that there is a scarcity problem in the world, that some people are going to be hungry. There's no way around it because there's not enough food. But that is a total lie.
Yeah.
There's very simple way to feed everybody in the world. And I'm like, I can't believe I would still had that in the back of my mind, that it's scarcity. And it came from like Israel. I'm like, okay, people need to know this stuff. So,
Yeah, from my end, so maybe I'll back up. Like, what is a UN Special Rapporteur? So I'm an independent expert. I'm not paid. I'm not the UN. I do this, the total mandate is 6 years. So the UN picked me. The governments of the world, I applied and they voted. And they said, we want this guy to be our leading right to food expert. So the way I often say is I'm the eyes, ears, and good conscience for the UN system on all matters regarding hunger, famine, and malnutrition from a human rights perspective. I talk to everybody. I travel the world. I talk to heads of state. I talk to activists, to peasants, to workers. My job is to learn from everybody and to share what I'm learning.
Share with who?
Everybody. So I always think of multiple audiences. My immediate formal audience for these reports and for the work is the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. I've been invited to brief the Security Council. I do a lot of work in Rome, where a lot of the food and agricultural organizations are based. But also my audience is the activists involved in these issues. But people reach out to me directly. They have complaints about their governments.
Yeah.
I talk to the world's leading experts. I talk to, again, it's truly everybody. So it's more about organizing the different constituents involved, especially with food. Who doesn't have an opinion and isn't affected by food or the lack thereof? And from the beginning of doing this report, because many of my friends, like Omar Khouri, like the people around Samanda really influenced me and inspired me.
Yeah.
The first comic magazine of its kind in the Arab world, they were all friends of mine doing this thing, they just created it out of just wanting to do something. And I grew up reading comics, and I understood the power of comics, you read and think and engage with the work differently. So from the beginning, I'm like, I want to do something with comics. I didn't know what. And I kept trying to find the opportunity and the idea and whatever. So when I reached out to Omar, it was before October 7, 2023. It was more about, listen, I've been asked explicitly by the General Assembly to answer the question, how do we end world hunger, truly? And I gave them an answer. It sounds funny to say, but I have 3 reports that says, this is how you can end world hunger. 1, 2, and 3 steps. It's very clear. And it's not knowledge that's special to me. It's by asking everyone, you're hungry. What do you need to make yourself not hungry? And people know what they need. So my job was to collect those stories, collect those ideas, but also talking to experts, put it all together. And I thought, what better way to show that we can actually do this? This is not a utopian fantasy.
Yeah.
We can actually change our food systems. Let's do it through a story, through comics. That was the idea. But then when October 7, October 8, October 9, and then I was focusing on the war in Gaza from the beginning. And I was following it on a daily basis. Because on October 9th, 2023, Israel announced its starvation campaign in genocidal terms, putting that war at the heart of my mandate. By the third week, we called it a genocide. By December, every single person in Gaza was hungry. 2.3 million people were made to go hungry. This was a speed never seen in the history of recording these things. Every famine expert I spoke to said, we've never seen so many people starved so quickly and so completely. And so working on that, I realized I need to write a full report about what does starvation mean, what is famine. I'm going to focus on Palestine, but keeping an eye on what is specific to Palestine, answering the question, how is this even possible? What were the conditions that made it possible for Israel to starve so many people so quickly and completely? Knowing that also answering that question is very specific geographically and historically to Palestine and to everybody's food system. And what better way to universalize a particular story than through a comic? Omar, yalla ta.
Yeah.
And we hung out and made a comic.
I spent like 6 months at the beginning of the year in Eugene, where he teaches at the University of Oregon, because I have the University of Oregon, they have a comics and cartoon studies department, and they had invited me to be part of an exhibition in their museum called The Art of the News that happened in 2019. So I have a relationship with the comics department there. And I've always been talking with one of the heads of the department, Catherine Kelp-Stebbins, her name is, and she always asks me like, "Oh, can I use this?" She writes a lot of books about comics and nonfiction, comics from the Arab world. She's like, it was like at the beginning of 2023 that it was really terrible here, and there came earthquakes. And she had asked me to do something for her, and I sent her a drawing, and she's like, "If there's anything that I can do ever for you," I'm like, "Catherine, I kind of want to leave the country for a bit. It's becoming kind of a nightmare. Would you guys want an artist in residence?" She's like, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Let me ask the rest of the department." The next day or 2 days later, she's like, "Oh, by the way, Michael sent me," and Michael Fakhri, he sent me an email. He had sent her an email being like, "What can we do to get Omar here because he wants to do comics?"
It was super
So
the
just kind of like aligned like that. And they're like, "All right, great." So they got me there, and we spent the horrors of the Palestinian, just also the beginning of it. It's still the horrors, but we kept losing track of what we wanted to do.
We didn't know what we wanted to do.
We were so angry. We're like, we want to do it about Palestine. We want to do about what's going on. And we kept falling into the trap of being like, oh, there's now this many people dead, like 50,000 people dead.
And this media every day.
It started to become like journalism instead of like a report. So we wrote and sketched out a number of comics that didn't end up being here because we were just frustrated and we wanted to speak about this in ever. And every time we'd get to the end and be like, should we execute this? We're like, wait, this isn't our specialty here. Mm-mm. Because we want to talk about the whole system. We want to talk about how it affects everything and how it's been going on forever. It's not just, so it was a long process that we went through.
Okay, I want to go through sort of a macabre part of this. If there was like starvation in a box and you conspired to starve people, 2 million people, how do you do that? Like what is the Israeli government actually doing? And what have they been doing for for months, for years, for decades? What have they been doing? How do you actually starve millions of people? You don't just like lock up the grocery store. What do you do?
It's a great question because that's what the whole report answers. And for me, what was, I don't want to say interesting. What was interesting for me to experience is you can answer that question and you can start at multiple points in time. It's a process that the way I then understood it's almost like they pressed a button, but how did you create that button in the first place? And what it took me back to the first Zionist settlements
Yeah.
in the late 19th century. From the beginning, were using food and agriculture as a mode of occupation, displacement, and oppression. So starvation is always about land. It's always about using food as a weapon to kill and harm people in a way that displaces them and disconnects them from their land, so that you, the person using starvation as the weapon, can then take that land. Always. Starting from the Irish famine, but under the British Empire, to the Bengal famine.
Not
exactly.
starvation.
Yeah, but by the British starvation of the Irish, exactly. To use
the potato famine now always makes me cringe. I'm like, no, it's starvation. Yeah.
And so it's always about land. Okay, that's the general thing. So and then you can play with time and space. So we can answer it let's start with Gaza. 1991. Israel starts thinking, okay, we're occupying Gaza. Let's start limiting the border a little bit. By 2000, it's a blockade. What's a blockade mean? They are measuring and regulating everything that goes in, everything that goes out, the smallest things. What's allowed in and what's allowed out. They're like, oh, coriander, that's not allowed in. Wedding dresses, chocolate, nope, not allowed in. So first, it's a matter of control. Controlling the border, controlling the food system. What seeds do you use? Fertilizer. How high are you allowed to grow your corn? So Israel controls that corn can't grow beyond a certain height because it becomes a threat. So first you have to have a significant amount of control over every aspect of daily life.
Yeah.
So 2000, I think around 2005, Israel changes the nature of its occupation of Gaza. It withdraws its settlers and military, and now occupies through controlling the border and sort of occupying by just choking it. So people think that the blockade starts in 2006, 2007. It starts in 2000. By 2000, 2006, 2007, we call it a siege, more military terms.
Yeah.
They're surrounding it now. And they're counting calories now. Right? In 2007, they're saying, we want to keep the Palestinians weak and hungry in Gaza. We're going to count every calorie that goes in.
And you know this because this is part of the national discourse. These are records of these conversations.
These
this
are records.
Public policy.
This is research done by human rights organizations that are well regarded. This is in the press. This is in the laws. And this is the work in collaboration with Zena Jalad, the director of the Palestine Land Studies Center, and a professor of international law at AUB, where I learned how the Israeli legal system, by design, creates these mechanisms.
Yeah.
So it's not a conspiracy, it's enacted in law. So if you just focus on Gaza, it's a story of blockade and siege. They're denying fishers access to the sea. They're using threats of violence. They're shooting at the fishers. They're killing them so they can't fish. You can't think about Gaza without the relationship to the sea. And so that control, they keep them hungry enough so that they're weak, but not so hungry that it raises international alarm bells, right?
How that's possible is beyond.
Yeah, if they're saying it publicly on their television, I don't understand how then people are like, no, it's not real. But like they've never hidden it ever. It's not just it's like literally what they say.
Counting calories, what the researchers, these are Israeli human rights researchers, uncovered this. It's in the, you just look at like it's almost like looking at actuarial tables.
Yeah.
Right? And so on October 6th, 2023, 50% of Palestinians in Gaza are food insecure, and 80% are dependent on humanitarian aid. So it's also, you make sure that people don't have a food system where they're able to feed themselves.
Yeah.
Whether through commerce, whether through growing, through whatever. So that when October 7 happens, Israel on October 9th is able to declare a starvation campaign because they've had the conditions of control in place for over 2 decades. That's Gaza. West Bank. What many people didn't realize, but I think people know now, is the West Bank has experienced record amounts of violence over the last 2 years. Record amounts of violence against farmers. and disrupting olive harvests, for example, and uprooting olive trees. So this idea of weaponizing food against the Palestinians is there from the beginning. I'll give you one more historical example. UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Work Agency, was created as a response to the Nakba, right? UNRWA was created around 1948. My numbers are a little fuzzy today. In the creation of UNRWA, if you look at its founding document, it is in response, amongst other things, to the threat of starvation against the people of Palestine.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, the creation of Israel itself created a risk of starvation against the Palestinians in Palestine, and it's recorded in and it leads to the creation of a UN agency.
Yeah.
It's all there. It's all there.
Okay. This is another question. And it's maybe like a little bit of an existential question and sort of about this document. What is the point of the UN?
Ask Omar. Omar's the only one who's on their payroll.
What is the point of the UN? If they don't actively respond to this crisis and crises that look like this.
Yeah. Rwanda, Bosnia.
It seems to me that I was talking to
Haiti.
somebody. Exactly. It seems to me I was talking to somebody about this, and I was saying, I'll lighten it a little bit, right? He was saying, oh, in high school I did MUN. I said, oh yeah, I did MUN too. And he said, isn't it so great? And I said, I actually think it's terrible that kids do MUN. He said, why? I said, because the UN is MUN. The UN itself is MUN.
It's pretending to be the UN.
It's pretending.
Yeah.
It is all pretend. It's play pretend, right? And so it's two people who are hardworking, diligent people whose motives are in the right place and are putting their blood, sweat, and tears in this. What is the point of this place?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one. That is existential, but I mean, there's a couple of layers to that because the UN isn't just one thing, right? There's the UN, which is supposed to be able to do stuff, but its job is basically to protect the interests of the colonial powers that won World War II. They're like, okay, we just want the world to do what we want. I mean, that's basically what it is. No, that's their job. But oh no, we're not just bombing things. We're also feeding the people that we're bombing, so we're not that bad. Is kind of But at the same time, there are so many people on the low. This is like the high level of UN, but the way I experience it. On the low, there are people on like the lower level, if you want to say, that are actually go into the UN in good faith. Like I've met a bunch of people, and we've worked with a bunch of people. They're like, there are people who really want to make a difference, but the system that they're working through, and a lot of them realize this, and I've spoken to a bunch of people like that. They're like, we come in like with good faith and, we want to change and we want to help the UN fix the world. But you realize that you're just working for this machine that, but all your work is going to stop somewhere because, I mean, so it's ridiculous. Like the head of UNICEF, is it? There's a woman who's the head of UNICEF whose husband is one of the shareholders in BlackRock, let's say. So she says, oh no, the poor children of Palestine are starving. Her husband makes millions and millions of dollars off of selling bombs to the Israelis to kill Palestinians. And that's kind of the structure of what I understand it of the UN as somebody who has been on the UN's payroll shamefully. He keeps saying like, I'm not the UN when we're talking, whereas people think he's the UN, but I'm being paid by the UN to tell people that the UN is terrible.
I mean, I could answer. I mean, if I could build on
please.
So this is my understanding of it. But
I mean, and I'll add another layer. Like, I'm an international lawyer too.
Also, great conversation to have.
Right? Like, and I come from a tradition. So it's a tradition in international law. We call it the third world approaches to international law, which comes from this idea of, there are moments when international law and the UN has been used as part of liberation movements, as part of resistance, a part of fighting against imperial power. So the story I tell myself goes something like this. There are multiple UNs operating in different realities in different ways, multiple histories operating within these institutions. There's the UN that was created in 1945-ish as a response to the end of the World War II, and the Security Council is created to sort of maintain a status quo of global power in the name of peace and security, not justice, and let the world powers divide up the world in a particular way, emphasizing peace and security. That, if you just look at the Security Council, that tells you that story. Come 1955, a bunch of us got a country now. In the mid-50s, by the mid-50s, a lot of countries in Asia, most of Africa is still colonized, and there's a conference in Bandung, Indonesia, the Afro-Asian Conference on, I forget the full title, we call it the Bandung Conference, where the theme was, we are now, the colonized peoples of Asia and Africa have their country or are going to get a country imminently in Africa. We're here to change the rules of the game against imperialism. And all of a sudden, there's a shift now. The majority of countries that have a vote in the United Nations are the former colonized people, the former wretched of the earth, if you will. It's a moment of potential. Come 1955, 1960, you know, we can use 1967 as the end of many things, right? But there's a tradition that they build, and it's now institutionalized. It still exists, this institutionalized sense of liberation and justice tradition is also operating within the UN. And I would add now a third layer, where it's now this grassroots engagement with the United Nations, where it's people's expectation of the UN and their sense of justice that comes from their particular struggle and their relationship of solidarity with other people in their struggle, connecting and using the UN as a conduit to express their sense of justice. People's expectation of the UN is a reality. So the challenge is, what do you do with in that space? The way I've navigated, and I have a different relationship than some of my colleagues and other special rapporteurs. Some people always will say, well, we have to be careful and not criticize the UN as such. It's all we've got. My response is that will lead us to a place of disappointment. Do you want to increase people's sense of freedom and give them liberation from oppression, occupation, and exploitation? Or do you want to protect the institution? It's not always the same goal. I will work, you have to work with the institutions you have. I will work through the UN and with the UN, but not to make the UN better unless I need to. I'm going to work through these institutions and they might crumble and collapse through my work. If the end goal is liberation, let the UN collapse. Let it fall upon itself. As long as we're working and building the next thing immediately, because we can have something worse. We can have something worse. So I'm always frustrated by people who take a cynical position or refuse to criticize it, but that's engaging. Engage, criticize, critique, yell at it, protest, throw things at it, of course. But if you ignore it or just shrug your shoulders and say, might is right is what determines the world, nothing will change. So you have to engage with it. You have to work with what you have. But where I differ is, but who gives a shit about the institution as such? Keep your eye on the ball, which is liberation. Yeah. From oppression, exploitation, and occupation.
Has there been an example in, let's say, the last 100 years where a dominant power is forcibly starving another, I guess there's no other way except forcibly, is starving another group of people, large group of people, and that starvation was stopped by an international community? Has that ever happened?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, there are famine experts that would probably have a better, but my answer is probably. I think there have been moments where the response has kept famine at bay, if you will, or avoided a famine. From what I've heard, and I can't, my only reluctance is I can't give you a concrete example, but I know exists. and the phrase international community might be too general, right?
Okay.
But there have been responses where famine has been avoided because people identified it. They mobilized the resources. But it's been in strictly humanitarian terms of getting food to people. What I don't know, and I don't think enough work has been done, is has there been the appropriate political response that have changed the conditions that made starvation possible in the first place? Probably not.
Yeah, like has a country who has been starving somebody else been basically held accountable for that action? Because what you're saying is it's most probably that famine has been stopped, which is famine in the abstract that does not have a subject that made it.
Yeah.
But starvation, no. Famine, yes. Basically, that's the simple answer to what you're saying. Because I don't, I mean.
Can we change Israel in a way that it can no longer be possible to starve Palestinians?
Yeah.
That's the what's another country that's starving? Sudan, the war in Sudan. You have these two factions. They're both starving the other side and the civilians.
Yeah.
Right? Can we change Sudan in a fundamentally way so that no party can starve the other? I'll add one more thing about starvation and famine. It's always international. So in Sudan, yes, it's a civil war, but the only reason both sides can starve civilians is because they're both supported by international forces.
Yeah.
Every permanent voting member of the Security Council, the so-called P5, either directly or indirectly supports famine and starvation today. Many rich countries directly or indirectly support starvation and famine today. So the reason it is very difficult to make starvation no longer possible is all the great powers love using it.
Yeah.
It's a very Lebanese story. All the Zama are enemies and hate each other, whatever, but what they can all agree on is a system where they can all exploit and benefit and steal from the
poor people.
From the people. Right? It's the same. Like, Russia and the United States are mortal enemies, but Russia, under their watch, allowed Azerbaijan to starve the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I say this on Armenian Christmas with a sense of irony. Meanwhile, the Americans are supporting Israel in a way that enables them to starve the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Yani Russia and America are no different from a right to food perspective.
But they have the veto. I mean, going back to the UN, it's that veto, the people who have the power of the veto, those main Security Council people that just that ruins kind of the whole idea of the UN in so many ways. Like, talk about the ideal of the UN to take us to liberation, whatever. But if those couple of superpowers still have the right to veto, you literally can't do anything.
Yeah.
Like, that's...
Yes and no. And so then the move that we're seeing around Palestine now is more energy being spent around the General Assembly, one country, one vote, and weirdly the International Court of Justice, which for the longest time I'm like, the International Court of Justice, what a waste of time.
Yeah, but can the International Court of Justice at the end actually practically do something? They can issue warrants and that's the whole thing. The people who actually physically can do something about it is then the people at the Security Council, which are American. All you need is that woman to go.
The picture in the comic.
The picture in the comic. Who the Americans were like, you need to take this out of the comic now.
There's a debate on can the General Assembly be used in a way to where there are certain provisions that say where the Security Council is not doing its job, the General Assembly can step in, and it's being pushed. Like, it's a debate. It's in play, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And is it possible then for the General Assembly? I mean, okay, I'm gonna go. Okay, I don't want to end up just having a discussion about you and me and you. Let's keep it on.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the nitty gritty that I don't think people know.
Yeah.
So there's a section in at least in this portion of the report that's specifically talking about fishing. And so maybe walk me through sort of the nuts and bolts of that policy. And maybe there's a very basic question. Let's start with a basic question. How does a normal, regular person who lives in Gaza eat fish? How does a fish end up on their plate?
It depends when. Now, before, 6 months, 2000, right? But in just very basic terms, let's step out of Gaza for a moment. This is where understanding international law matters. One of the most powerful things international law does is it creates boundaries and borders. So when people ask the question, is international law real or is it even law? I always say, every time someone has looked at your passport and decided whether you're allowed in or out, that's international law in action. Sovereignty, boundaries, that sort of thing. Every country has sovereignty and has different types of degrees of control and authority over the sea, measured in nautical miles. So under Oslo, the Palestinian people have 8 nautical miles from the coast to go fishing. After a certain amount of distance from land, then it's what's called the high seas.
What can you compare that to, like somebody in Beirut?
Beirut, you can go.
How many nautical miles can we go up?
Probably 8. My law of the sea is rusty. I should have brushed up
but
on it.
it's a similar.
Just
Okay.
like, okay, Lebanese fishers, any person in Lebanon can go out a certain number of nautical miles and go fishing. And every country can control the rules of where you can fish and how you can fish and when you can fish.
Yeah.
And how, like, because you have to also maintain the, don't want overfishing and this and that.
Sure.
But it's about power and control over a certain distance.
Yeah.
And so,
But the Lebanese people, more than the people in Gaza, are much less because they're stopped by
This is where it gets
the Israeli
unique.
army.
Exactly.
The Lebanese peoples definitely have more because it's just the official border of Lebanon, the nautical border of Lebanon, which is more than, yeah, exactly. We don't know the numbers of that, but it's definitely more than 8.
Yeah.
Like
8 is because of
miles is
Oslo.
like nothing.
Yeah, 8 is
Okay.
because of Oslo. So even 8, the Israelis have not allowed Palestinian fishers to even go within the 8. I think they keep it within 2 or something like
It's
that.
6. I think the Oslo is the number is actually right
Yeah.
there. The Oslo is a bit more. Yeah, it's 20 nautical miles.
20 is
Oslo.
this norm. Hey,
Was
20 is the-
Oslo,
hey, 20 is
and then
the-
they held it to brought it back to 6.
There we go.
At the,
Those are the numbers. Okay. So 20 is about, most I think get within 20. They're just not letting them get to the sea. I mean, that's the short. To get fishers risk their life.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to read what it says here.
That's
because
helpful.
I want to read what it says here. So it's basically saying, under Oslo Accords, Palestinians were supposed to be able to fish within 20 nautical miles from the shore. Israel, through the blockade, limited fishers to about 6 nautical miles from the shore, where fishing was not easy due to shallow waters with sandy and rocky seafloors. Okay. This is obviously intentional.
Yeah.
This is
they stopped it on the bad fishing part. They're
Yeah.
like, oh, well, there's no fish here. Yeah, you can fish till where you.
And they
there's
call
no
it a
fish.
security threat. That's why they're not letting them go
Okay.
more than 6.
And this has been going on for years and years and years, since basically the early 2000s.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it sounds about right. I'm not sure when they sort of blocked it at the 6, but yeah.
Okay, so that's like, that's an entire food group.
Yeah.
So this is an entire source of protein, entire
And an
food group.
entire source of culture.
Sah.
Yeah, and how you eat is how you express who you are and how you express your relationship with the land and the water. There's certain dishes that Gaza is known for its relationship to the sea. And if you don't have access to the things that make you Ghazewe, then who are you?
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on, you mentioned coriander. Where do you get seeds? Let's talk about seeds.
So that's seeds are the most important thing. I mean, it's tried to say, I wrote a whole report on seeds, and the first line is seeds are life. And people don't realize that, as obvious it is to say. Whoever controls the seeds controls life itself. So one thing what Israel has done is across the occupied Palestinian territories is forced farmers or convinced farmers to buy seeds from agrochemical companies, which means then you're growing plants where the seeds you're not able to regrow from them. You're always forced to buy from the company. It's a relationship of dependency. Bringing in seeds is very difficult. Saving seeds sometimes is made illegal. Saving seeds is the most important thing anyone can do to save their food system and not go hungry.
Yeah.
And I've worked with, and I always learn from people who work with seeds. An example in Palestine is Vivian Samsour and her work with seed libraries, amongst others. There are several others. In Lebanon, Budurna, Juturna do excellent work. But for those listening that are thinking like, just start thinking about engaging with and learning from the world of seeds. It's everything. It's everything. And it should be free. You should be able to exchange seeds freely and this isn't just in Gaza, in the whole world, companies are privatizing seeds, turning life into property. Property, what's property? Property is the power to deny someone access to a resource. A resource is already an economic term. Property is the power to deny people access to life and land. Mine, not yours. Yep. Or if you want it, you have to pay me. So the access to seeds is at the heart of the whole global struggle to have food systems that are able to feed people. So companies that used to be called Monsanto, I forget what they're called now, would go after farmers and sue them for saving seeds, the most basic practice one has. Yeah.
Is this something that, is it different in Gaza versus the West Bank, or versus Palestinians 48? Like, is it being regulated everywhere because the idea is that we need the ability to starve everyone anytime, anywhere?
I wish, I would have to talk to my Palestinian lawyer friends like Zena Jallad to get a better sense, because I do know what Israel does is it fragments the Palestinians.
Yeah.
So take the West Bank is already fragmented into areas A, B, and C. And then, of course, if you're a Palestinian living in Israel, you're under a set of laws. And then Gaza is under a certain set of laws. And then if you're a refugee in an UNRWA camp, under a certain set of laws. And then religion and status, they fragment the land and they fragment the people. And so I wouldn't be surprised if then the seed system is fragmented and there's multiple laws operating in very different ways. And this is all by design, because when you fragment it, that's another way of erasing a people.
So,
but this is also just that example of how this problem is really how the entire agricultural system around the world is working and how it's dealing with seeds, right? It's not specific to, it's kind of like an experimental ground. Let's try it here. And then all of wheat is now one all over the world. It's like a monoculture in this whole thing. It's connected to that global problem. It's not something that's just happening there. And people in a lot of indigenous, we interviewed some people in Rome, and Dionisio, for instance, and he was talking about like people would come and give you seeds, like then that they feed them to the pigs, then they just want to have the seeds that they're used to as indigenous people, because they know what is here and what lasts through the winter properly, and because taking care of all these monocultures of seeds is just, you have to rely on the mega corporations everywhere. So it just brings it back to that. Anyway.
Okay, I want to talk, maybe there's a good place to try to end, which is the impact. So you were talking, originally you were asking me before we started, you said, Mikey, who's the audience for this episode? And I attended a talk, which is how this all started. I attended a talk that you guys were speaking at, or you guys participated in New York. And the audience in the room, it was at the New School, there are people who agree with the report before they even read it, right? There are people who are nodding, just like me, nodding in agreement that this needs to end, this needs to end. I wonder how this is received by people who are on the fence. Are there even people on the fence?
There are people that have been fighting this report before we were able to publish it.
Does it move the needle for these people? I mean,
No, that's a great question.
I mean, it's a very difficult question.
Here's how I would answer. So first, on the realm of ideas, I think part of your question is like, does it change people's mind? I'm at the point where if you don't think it's genocide and starvation, I'm not going to bother convincing you. There are enough reports and people have been documenting their own genocide for over a year. So what am I doing telling this story?
Yeah.
When we did this report, part of it was to connect what was particular to Palestine, but to broaden it out to we are in a global food crisis. Hunger is on the rise everywhere, and food systems everywhere are producing violence and not just food. And part of what this report does that we're not seeing done elsewhere is connecting what is to universalize the Palestinian struggle And often I get asked, why did you focus on Palestine and not Sudan and not Haiti and not. And my answer is, that's the wrong question. The question is, why have millions of people marched to support the Palestinian people in ways we've never seen before? Why is every social movement in the world standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people? Why are we hearing slogans like Free Palestine at a moment I would have never thought I'd hear that in my lifetime? It's because everyone sees their own struggle in the Palestinian struggle. So one, it's the connection between the particular and the universal. That's what we've been doing. So even to the people nodding, they're still learning something. And I've received that feedback. And they're still understanding the notion of solidarity in a different or deeper way. The other thing is, it's still hard to understand famine and starvation, to get it. And the biggest surprise, in a good way, that I got from this report was the one illustration we almost didn't put in there was the list of ingredients. That one, I've received this feedback time and time and time again. It has moved people to tears. It's just a list. It's just a list. But it's a list with these white spaces. And the feedback I always receive is, I never really understood what starvation is till I saw those white spaces. And so we can nod our head, but there's something about a comic that makes you understand it in a deeper way.
Yeah. Can I just read some of the white spaces?
Yes.
So instead of 1/2 cup of samat berries, use dried samat sparingly. Instead of 4 large onions, no onions. Instead of 1 head of garlic, no garlic. Instead of 5 green peppers, no green peppers. Instead of 1 hot chili pepper, no hot chili pepper. And it's just like, you basically
And
have
it's
it.
The thing of the
This
thing
is
of
the
the
dish.
list is that originally it was just going to be a list, but then we looked at it and I thought, well,
This was Omar's
some of
idea.
because some of the things where you're saying like use dried sumat sparingly, there's more words than use 1/2 cup of whatever. Like in the starving column, sometimes there were more words. So if it's just a list of words, you look at them, they kind of look the same to you, and that's why I thought, all right. If it's not just it's a visual list as well, and you can see the blank there, then that will give you the idea. And it does something different than seeing a starving child with, like, we've all seen this kind of image of the kid that is emaciated and starving, and this is like somebody being violent to you. There's something violent to the viewer about it that makes them shut down, where you don't have this reaction when you see something. Like, this is the idea behind this. Like, I'm not showing you starving people. I'm showing you the absence of things that you would take for granted to
that
eat.
That space is both horrific and a space of understanding.
And it's a space that doesn't, like, the censorship of your brain doesn't be like, whoa, I can't look at this any longer. You can you can look at it and you're like, why is this bothering me?
Yeah.
And that's
Because when somebody says I'm starving, right? Or like people are starving, it's almost like it's hard. My simple brain thinks that the completed meal isn't there for you, right? Like, oh, you don't have lasagna, you don't have even like a banana, like something like the final product that you will eat, But the idea that you don't have a head of garlic, just like the building, the component, you don't even have 1 green pepper.
Yeah.
Not even 1.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no choice.
Yeah,
like,
the
I have the
ingredients-
green pepper. What am I going to do with it?
Yeah. And you don't even have the seeds to grow the green pepper.
Right.
you're not allowed to have the seeds to grow it.
Nor
And
the water
if
to
you do-
water it.
If you do, and they'll burn your land. If they see, wait, no, this guy saved a seed and built it up, then they can just white phosphorus it, and then the land can no longer. I mean, there's also that. You can just destroy the land with white phosphorus, which is a lot of what happened in Gaza and in south of Lebanon as well. They just, even if you do have the seeds, there's nowhere for you to put them. So they're blocking it from all possible ways.
So by breaking it down, we can think of it systemically.
Yeah.
And the last point I want to say about the report, and this is the work I do, when you said, what's the UN for? I don't know what the UN, I know what my job is sometimes is to poke and see what happens. I'm independent. I don't do this for the money. It's a full-time job where on top of a full-time job, on top of full-time parenting. The most I can do is learn. I've given up on I'm not going to change the world, man. But I'm going to poke. And the response, we're all going to learn from it. We made a comic. They tried to censor us. They tried to stop us at the highest levels.
The dragons are now anti-Semitic because of this report. Officially, you can't have dragons because a dragon is now an anti-Semitic symbol. Even though we don't say that the dragon in our report is Israel, we're talking about the dragon is
the systemic forces that make all food systems bad.
And that's the dragon. It's now, there was a complaint.
So Israel complained about the report, saying the report is anti-Semitic. And then you read their allegations, and their allegations will be public very soon. They're ridiculous. But just simply by Israel complaining, and where the content of their complaint was meaningless, the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations itself spent significant time and energy at the highest levels to stop our comic from being published. And the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the United Nations spent time and resources to try and stop the publication and dissemination of this report. These are both offices that have still not formally recognized the genocide in Gaza. So rather than spending time and energy on what matters, they'd rather spend time and energy blocking a report that they know is true and is reaching millions of people with the truth.
In a way that is understandable, accessible to the general public, and you don't have to be a specialist in food to sit and read a thick report.
And they refuse to interpret it in the UN languages as they were required. And then after the publication of this illustrated report, they changed the rules to disallow anyone else to ever write a comic or illustration ever again in a UN report.
Wow.
Yeah, they just made that rule
and
because
that
of
told
this.
me we're doing our job.
Basically our job is to make these people sweat. These people who make decisions and aren't going to change their minds. Yeah, making them sweat and worry about
Two middle-aged dudes from Lebanon writing comics was the greatest threat to the human rights reporting system. That they couldn't handle. We're doing our job and they're not.
Yeah.
As long as if they're making all the money and if they're making all of they're having the best food and all this stuff, at least we'll make them sweat and give them digestion by doing these things. If they're not going to give food to the Palestinians, at least they're going to enjoy their food less. If that's all we can get,
and we share the story publicly. Now we know. Where's the problem? It's that the problem is at the highest levels. It's the High Commissioner and the Secretary General themselves and the people working in that office and the institutional structures around them. That it's not just the criticisms from Israel. It's how they respond to the criticism of Israel with fear of what now? What are they afraid of?
The irony is, at the same time where they're blocking this report and they're bending over backwards to appease the UN, the UN Israeli permanent delegate, the Israelis were shooting the UN soldiers in the south of Lebanon literally the same day. When I got I got the news that this
Israel's
report has been
attacking
taken off of the official website, Israeli soldiers were literally shooting the UN. And a week before, what's his name was persona non grata.
So Israel's been attacking the UN. They declared the Secretary General persona non grata. They refused to comply with Security Council resolutions and International Court of Justice decisions before the ink is dry. They attacked the independent human rights experts. And then even most recently, the head of the WHO was almost killed, and they knew his whereabouts. They knew, and they basically put his life at risk. So Israel's attacking the United Nations, and the United Nations, through its civil servants at the highest level, rather than defending the United Nations in the sense of justice and multilateralism, are instead trying to appease the very powers that are attacking them. what I've heard, the part that remains a mystery to me is then I've heard ambassadors say when Israel attacks the UN, it's attacking all of us. And I followed up with, they said this to me. I'm like, what are you going to do? Silence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The people on the fence, not the people who are, the people who on the fence who are not necessarily unable to understand the report. They are not refuting it while the ink is still dry, isn't dry, or hasn't dried yet. Does this embolden them? Does this give them courage?
The people who are like, oh, it's a complicated situation.
And maybe
like
even
those
they
people,
understand, but they say, I'm too scared to say anything.
I mean, you'll have to ask them. I don't know. I haven't specifically
That's not my
met
audience.
somebody. Yeah, I don't. It's
Not
we
my
don't.
audience.
If we know these people directly, we would have already convinced them. You know what I mean before this report.
Yeah.
So I don't know how one would get this kind of data, but
You know, at best is this. Where I have met people on the fence, people I respect early on, when I think I was more tolerant to engage with a person, maybe reluctant to call it genocide, which I understood early on to some degree, or it's really complicated way of thinking. I think a report like this, if they read it in good faith, will at least make them more open to now listen and look in a different way. That's the most I think I can imagine, where they're like, because it's hard to change your mind. It really does take time. So when they see something like this written in a particular way, drawn in a particular way, they might next time then they might hear an activist or a Palestinian or something on the news. That might be the first time they listen to it differently. At best. But like I said, I'm no longer patient with that audience.
Okay, what's next for this? This is being translated and released.
Released in Arabic on Megaphone News already. It's been translated.
So how's that available? Is it through Megaphone?
It's on their website. It's on Megaphone's website in Arabic.
It was interpreted in Spanish?
In Spanish, it's in a Spanish magazine.
Through a magazine. So it's I think
there's somebody interested in
certain
translating
activists, I think in
Italian.
Indonesian, one of the Indonesian languages, if I recall. What's happening is because the UN refused to interpret it in the official UN languages as they had to do, but they chose not to.
It's funny because I couldn't find this on the UN website.
It's hard to find
They
on the
hid
website.
it. Then they kept hiding it further and further with more Israeli complaints. They took it from originally it was supposed to be within the pages of the written report, and then they pushed us back to be like, no, you have to be at the bottom. It's an annex at the bottom of the report.
Yeah.
Then it went through, and then the deputy secretary general was like, wait, this says something, we can't have it. So they're like, it could be on a separate website.
It's super buried.
Somewhere else. And then the separate website had a link on the main website of the thing. And then they took that out as well.
Okay.
So and now it's just like buried somewhere
buried.
very deep in the UN because of all these. Every time another person with power would read it, be like, "Wait, this says so." Like
I
this
do
makes
want to add
everything so
something.
obvious.
We
and
had a
moves it
lot
back.
of allies within the UN.
Yeah.
And that's what made it possible. We had so many people champion this.
Yeah.
And so it is the product of people fighting us, but it's also the product of people on the inside
For sure.
championing.
Last question is, who actually owns this?
No, it's open source.
Everybody.
Okay.
You can do whatever you want with it. You
So
whatever.
we can post some of this on our
You can
website.
post all of it. You could put a link.
Yeah,
I can give you the link for the official link that's on the UN page as well.
Okay. So we will post this on our website so people can find it.
There's
And-
Cartoonists for Palestine. It's going to be on the Cartoonists for Palestine website. In English, Cartoonists for Palestine is of this book that's be collecting a number of artists, comic book artists and cartoonists who have been writing and drawing about Palestine since October 7th.
Okay. Amazing.
So it's going to be in a number of places, and we're going to
keep working together.
Keep working on it. We're going to do it. We like making people angry at the UN. So we're making comics as long as people are going to hate us for it.
We're going to continue
Yeah.
jamming and making comics and rabble-rousing.
Yeah. It's really powerful. Thanks so much. I know you guys are super busy this week, so
Thank
thanks
you,
so much
Mike.
for
It was a
making time
pleasure.
this.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was lovely chatting.
All right. Thanks so much.